Today, we're talking a lot about welcome, and we've already had several welcomes this morning. The welcome as we came in, the welcome to visitors, and I bring another welcome. And it's good to be with you here today. My name is Jonathan Seitz, and I was involved in the English ministry about 15 years ago when it first started. And during times of transition, or even a few times a year, I just kind of pop up. I pop up and say hello and greet you all. And I'm a teacher at Taiwan Seminary, so it's just really fun to be with this church. And you can hear from my voice, I have kind of like a East Coast Midwest accent in the U.S. So my people are very informal. Like if we welcome you, usually we just say like, come on in, have a seat, good to see you, hey, hi, how's it going? That's our kind of welcome. But today as we talk about welcome, I know in many cultures a welcome is very formal. And it's a way to show kindness and respect to people. So I was Stephen Lacus's neighbor for about 5 or 6 years, and he's of Lebanese descent from Lebanon. So he had a very formal welcome, kind of like if you came over to his house, they'd bring out the good teapot and the home-baked goods and invite you to sit down and really talk to you and interact with you. So I hope as you come to this church, you receive that kind of welcome also, that when you come here, people meet you and know you and greet you, and you feel very welcome. When I was in seminary, I spent one summer in Ghana, and Ghana is also a culture where welcome is very important. And they have a word in one of the official languages is called Chui, T-W-I, Chui, and their greeting is Akwaba. And their greeting translates as like, you are most welcome. So one of the fun things there was, in English also, when people greet you, they say like, you are most welcome, or you are very welcome. And I always like that. I like that sense of beyond having grown up with, hey, or how's it going? I like that you are very welcome, that people would say to you and really mean it. So today also I say to you all, you are very welcome here at Shuanglian Presbyterian Church English Ministry. And I think in Taiwanese culture, welcome is also very important. In Chinese, it's not one of the first words we learn. You know, your first 100 words are like, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then you move on to the like, 我, 你, 他, 他们, and those words. But once you get about 200 or 300 words in, you get one of the most terrible characters in Chinese is the Huan of Huanying, right? Is welcome. The first character has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22 strokes, right? So this one I must have learned fairly early on because most characters I start to forget, but I always think that welcome in Chinese is not a very welcoming character. It's a very hard to write character, especially for the foreigners who didn't grow up learning it. But you really do see it a lot, right? You see it in every store. You hear the Huanying Guanlin, you hear people welcome you. That welcome is a character that you see over and over again in any store that you go into. So today's Bible passage is also a passage about welcome. And it comes as part of this sequence that Jesus does in Matthew 10. I didn't know it, but sometimes Matthew 10 is called the mission discourse, or the little mission discourse. It's a passage about sending the disciples out. So in this passage, welcome is very important. So it comes after the calling of the disciples. Somewhere in this chapter, Jesus talks about taking up your cross and following him. And today's passage is a passage about hospitality. And I realized as I started to work on this that actually I've preached a lot of different sermons that relate to hospitality. When we went back to the U.S., we talked about the sending of the disciples and how they seek welcome wherever they go, you know, that they're supposed to go out without anything and be welcomed wherever they are. In today's passage, Jesus also talks about welcome. He says, whoever welcomes you welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. And Jesus may be talking here about how or when we welcome a visitor, or how when we welcome Jesus, we're also welcoming God. That this is an old idea in Christianity, is that in welcoming the stranger, we welcome God. And in today's passage, Jesus says that when you welcome me, you welcome the one who sent me. When you welcome them, you welcome the one who sent them. And one of the things I've learned over the years is that often when we welcome or when we're welcomed, it's because of all these connections we have in common, right? That often the reason I'm welcomed in Taiwan is because I had predecessors that did good work here. Or often if I welcome somebody, we may have a friend in common or a family member in common. I also know that often when I welcome a stranger, they're not really a stranger. A lot of the strangers we meet, we have something in common with. But one of the tests of our faith is how do we do it welcoming strangers? How do we do it welcoming people we don't know, people who just show up and say hello to us? So for Jesus, those who welcome him are welcoming God. The next part of the passage is an interesting one because it sets up several other relationships. Jesus says, whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. And whoever welcomes a righteous person in the name of a righteous person will receive the reward of the righteous. And whoever gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones in the name of a disciple, truly I tell you, none of these will lose their reward. So I kind of wrote out this progression that goes on there where Jesus says, whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Whoever welcomes a prophet, whoever welcomes a righteous person, whoever welcomes a little one. And in this part, I'm not 100% sure of what Jesus meant, but I think what he was saying is he was explaining that three people we often encounter sometimes are prophets and the righteous, and there's debate about little ones. Does little ones mean children, or here it might mean the disciples? But part of the standard of hospitality that Jesus offers is very simple. It's a cup of cold water. It's the welcome that we give to people that we meet along the way, wherever we go. So in the Bible and in life, sometimes we're the guest and sometimes we're the host. I don't know which is harder for you. For me, sometimes it's harder to be the guest. Like I'm fairly independent and I like to rely on myself. So sometimes it's hard to go and be on somebody else's schedule and live life the way they live life and do things the way they do things. But I also really value that I'm really grateful in my life. Especially living cross-culturally, it means that often we depend on the kindness of strangers. Do the people at the tax office welcome us? You know, like who will help me do my taxes? And if I have trouble communicating with somebody, who will help me do that? That in a lot of my life, especially living in Taiwan, I'm a guest. That I speak my Chinese at kind of elementary school level, and I depend on the kindness of strangers, on the one who will welcome this person that just shows up. And my guess is that you're like that also. In Chinese also, I learned there are two words for welcome. There's the welcome as like the general welcome word with the 22 strokes, the huan ying. But there's also a word for like how do you say like I welcome you? Is it like 我接待你 or something? There's like a different word, like the verb, like I wouldn't say 我欢迎你, would I? Could you say that? Oh, okay, maybe I'm wrong. Okay, so anyways, I know sometimes there are different words for like welcome or receive somebody. And I often remember times in life where as a guest I've relied on the help of others just in order to get by. One of those is that same summer I was in Ghana for the last part of my flight home. I thought I had been booked into like a retreat center in Accra, and when I got there they were full. No space for you. So I called up the other mission workers from Presbyterian Church, and they, I don't even know how I got to the place, but I got over there and they welcomed me and took me into their family for a couple days, and I was able to make my flight and go back home. Probably a lot of you have stories of that also in your life, of stories when you've been a stranger and there was no way clearly forward until somebody welcomed you and took you under their wing. I know at the seminary, when I came to Taiwan Seminary, there were certain people who helped me a lot. Like one was the Chen Changren, sort of helped guide me through how does the seminary work in Taiwan versus in the US. And we also had a dean of students at the time, Su Mei Jen, and she was the one who had a lot of the daily life stuff for us, so that when we showed up, there was already toilet paper and shampoo and soap and things to get started. So for a lot of us, when we travel, we have that sense of being welcomed by others. At other times, we're the host. And being a good host also means thinking ahead and planning for all the possibilities. Being a host means that you're the face of welcome. There are a lot of passages in the Bible about hosting. A few months ago, I preached on Martha and Mary, and they welcomed Jesus and his disciples. And one of the interesting things there is Martha did all of the traditional host duties of having stuff ready, getting the food prepared, being ready so that the physical needs of Jesus and the disciples would be met. But part of being a good host was also to be with your guest and to care for them. So Mary was the one who was just there listening to everything Jesus said and talking to them. So I think for us also, as a host, that's one of the challenges in our life, is how do we meet people, not just their physical needs, but how do we know that we really care about them as a person? Being a host means welcoming people and providing for their needs, but it's different from running a hotel or a bread and breakfast or an Airbnb. Instead, it means really caring for people. A friend of mine recently on Facebook, he posted a saying that his father often said. He said, "Be thrifty with yourself and generous with other people." I thought that was a good way to live, that often as a host it means you provide the best of what you have to the guest that comes to let them know you care about them. We can ask for ourselves, who will we welcome? If we're the host, who will we welcome? Do we welcome people only because of the connections we have in common? Like maybe you have that sense sometimes that people are nice to you because you're there, because you have like a friend or a coworker or something in common. Do we treat the powerful more hospitably than the powerless? What do we do if we have a difficult guest? The passage doesn't talk about that, but and I think it's in English there's a saying, I forget if it's 3 days or 7 days, that fish and house guests start to stink after 3 days, I think is the old saying. That sometimes it's fun to be together for 3 days or 7 days, but as the host, how do you continue to be a good host to people, even if it's challenging? And in the Bible passage, I wonder who it is that welcomed the disciples. When they went out and traveled from place to place, how were they greeted? Were they kind of the young students appearing, and it was that kind of relationship, or were they seen as representing Jesus and sharing his message? Did people already know of them when they arrived, or were they just greeted just on the basis of how they said hello and how they made their own greetings? I think for us, it's also a challenge is how to welcome and how to greet. The flip side of the list of people that Jesus gives is that they were not always warmly welcomed, right? Like the 3 ones he lists are prophet, righteous one, and little ones. So prophets were often stoned and rejected and thrown out. That sometimes when a prophet shows up, we don't want to hear their words of criticism. It's kind of like we want the polite talk of the guest. We don't want to hear the hard words of the prophet. Or the righteous one also, to have somebody that you see lives their life really with integrity can be challenging to us. It makes us feel like maybe we're not good enough or we have to work harder. Or I wonder what it means by those little ones. Like I think for me, children are still a model of how to live in the world, that children often have like an excitement and energy about life, even though they're very difficult to be around sometimes. It takes a lot. To welcome a child is not always an easy thing. So the passages on welcoming in the Bible, at first they seem kind of light and easy, maybe like a Martha Stewart article. I don't know if you've ever seen those Good Housekeeping magazines, all these magazines about hosting. Most of them are about the outward appearance, about having a beautiful place and delicious looking food and that. But there's also a harder truth in today's passage, that hospitality calls us to a higher standard and to a better way of loving our neighbor. Okay. So today when I came back, I wasn't totally sure what to share about. At first I was invited for 2 weeks ago, and then my good friend Jacque and I switched. So she preached the 14th and I came today. Last Sunday was the last Sunday that Stephen Lacus was here officially as pastor. It was probably emotional for a lot of you. It was like a saying goodbye. It was a big chapter in the life of this ministry. He's been here for about half of the English ministry's existence. He and Peter kind of have been the leaders over the first 12 or almost 15 years now, 14 years. So last year when I went to New Jersey for the year, I had the chance to take like about a 5-minute walk from me at the seminary I was staying at. They had a course called Interim Ministry Training. And I had heard about interim ministry because my parents are both retired pastors, and they did it for a while. Like there was one time where my mom took a church, and then my dad was an interim pastor for 7 years, and he would go to different churches for like a year or a year and a half, and then leave. And it's a very American, it's very popular in my church and Presbyterian Church USA, but it hasn't really caught on around the world. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Like there's some problems with this model, but the way it works is kind of like every time you have a transition, you take a little bit of time and you think to yourself, like, how are we doing and what are we going to do next? And in the training, they talked about different things. Like one of the things they talked about was like telling our story. Like some of the churches, they take a big roll of paper and put it out and put the start date of the church and the end date. And people go up and write different things. You know, this is when I joined the church, or this is when my child was born, or this is when we had a really awesome outreach event, or this is when this pastor left, or they have all the different things you can put on that timeline. They also talked about reconnecting, that often you get sort of like used to doing things the way the pastor does them, and then when you have a pastoral change, you have to figure out, like, what do we do next? So it was interesting this morning, like it's all looking pretty smooth up here, but especially talking with Jennifer, we were trying to figure out, like, Pastor Stephen would do all these prayers and all these different introductions. So now that he's gone, who does all of that? And Jennifer kind of popped up and did that. Or maybe the technology changes a little bit, so you have to figure out how do we do technology in a way that in transitions, a lot of times you mix up the way you do things, and it's a little bit uncomfortable sometimes, right? Like you're used to going along and doing it one way, now you have to do it another way. Another one they talked about, like it's not in this church, but in a lot of churches in the US, if they have conflict, it's because like a pastor was forced to leave, or if there was an affair in the congregation, or if there was a big fight over something, maybe it's what color we put up on the thing, should it be green or should it be purple, and we fight until half the church leaves. Then after that happens, they would often bring in like an interim pastor who would sort of like work through the conflict with that church. And the other thing they have is they talk about planning together. It's like a chance to sort of reconsider, like, who are we as a congregation? Why are we here? What is our mission? What people has God called us to welcome? How did we come to be here? What is our mission in the community and in the world? So for me, I thought it was an interesting training. Like I've never been like a long-term pastor in a church. It's a little bit different from me, but I think especially for those of us who live cross-culturally, we have a lot of interim periods in our life. So this type of training, it's become popular also for people who just are in transitional ministry. Like if you're a pastor to college students, every 4 years, all of your students leave, and that's like a big adjustment, right? Or if you're in a hospital, in some hospitals, if you work with hospice or something, if you're a hospice chaplain, you have constant loss in your life, that your patients you care for are often dying, right? And you have to make sense of that. So I like this discussion of interim ministry, and it's also interesting because the people that do interim ministry tend to be people that travel a lot and are up for all sorts of different experiences. And because they've seen 10 churches in 10 years, often they've seen everything that can happen in a church. All of the wonderful behavior and all of the terrible behavior, they've all seen in these 10 years. I don't think this is necessarily something for EM, but I think it's something to think about now, that in this period of transition, a lot of time it feels stressful. Like we're used to having Pastor Stephen every week is going to do the birthday greetings correctly, and he's going to email people, and he knows for sure like how to not double click on the clicker and like which microphone goes on. And for like at least for a few months, you'll probably have some kind of discomfort with that there are these periods of transition. But they're also like a real opportunity for churches because they're there's new freedom too, that maybe everything that you gave to the pastor before is a chance to redistribute some of it and for other people to try that out also, so that if you enjoy sharing or praying or visiting people, if there are gifts you have that you want to use for the good of the congregation, you can use those. And I was remembering a little bit, the last time this happened was about 6 years ago when Pastor Peter left, and there was also about 6 months where there was, every month 4 different people would preach in kind of a rotation. And I know Elder Sue and others had organized like a couple sessions where the congregation sort of reconnected and thought about like, who are we as a church and what do we want to do? So this is kind of like an inside story that I'm telling you right now, this interim ministry. It's some of the like nuts and bolts, but I want you to think about it a little bit in your own life of like, what are your hopes and prayers for this ministry? What are ways that you can encourage the leaders of the church during times of transition? As leaders, what do you need to keep you fed if you don't have Pastor Stephen checking up on you? Like, what helps you in your day-to-day work? Okay, so that's a little bit of an aside. We can do that. So for this congregation, I also have kind of some advice based on this welcoming and also during this time of transition. One of them is to expect misunderstandings and to learn to host others. That the expecting misunderstandings is because often when you're a guest and when you're a host, you have different roles. You don't always know how to do things. A few years ago, we went to Massachusetts and visited my aunt, and I had to learn the geography all over again. It was a place I hadn't been in 30 years, so I would get lost all the time. Like I was used to being very familiar, and instead I would get lost in this little tiny town where all the houses looked the same to me. And I didn't really know how to be in a different space with my kids. So like when do you put them to bed, and what do they do from our family and from other families? So I imagine you all have a lot of that also, that in life, when we live cross-culturally, in a sense, we expect misunderstandings. We know that some of the times, despite our best intentions, we'll do something that offends other people. We'll make mistakes, and we might hurt other people's feelings or do something you're not supposed to do. So the gift of a church like EM is hopefully that this is also a place to practice and a place to like live with those misunderstandings and help people to live cross-culturally. So one of my advice for us is to keep working on that, is not to feel upset when there's a misunderstanding, not to feel upset if something goes wrong, but to focus on how can we still give Jesus his welcome, even if our guests come and they don't know how to do things the right way, or even if we feel upset traveling and we get lost, how do we continue to be a good guest and a good host? My second hope is that you'll consider new possibilities. I had sort of forgotten about it, but during the last transition, I know Pastor Patty did some work with youth in the community. Stephen has added, I saw there's some work with homelessness in this church now. That one of the things that changes in a community like this is that we don't even think about things until somebody shows up and says, here's a new possibility, and it might be related to worship, it might be related to fellowship, but this is a time to think about new possibilities. And I think for Jesus, as he sent the disciples out also, they were introducing new teachings. I wonder what that felt like to the people they met when they heard Jesus' interpretation of how to live life, how to be faithful to God. I wonder what they thought of that. And the third one is to greet the stranger. That a lot of times in life, when we meet strangers, we feel awkward or we might tend to avoid them. But for Christians, like one of our main callings is to greet and welcome strangers to our midst. That's like a core part of who we are. And I've talked a little bit from my own perspective of how I've often been grateful to the church for welcoming me when I was a stranger or when I was a guest. But I also know one of the things I love about a church is that it brings people in all the time that come through, and you never know what they're working on. I hope for you all that for EM ministry that this is a chance to connect people to our church and that you welcome strangers and show them your care. And then related to that, I have sort of three prayers for us as we go out today. One is that we will learn to be good guests ourselves, that we will follow Jesus' model of discipleship in our own life, that we'll practice being good guests and going out and being willing to go beyond our comfort zone and to be greeted. The second is that we'll seek opportunities to expand our welcome to those that we wouldn't normally think of. So I think a danger for all of us in life is we get used to complacency. We get used to not liking change, to thinking like, if it's been this way, let's keep doing it that way. But this is, it's often in the cross-cultural life is often when we really find chances to expand our welcome. And the third is I want you all to think about this idea of the ministry of all people. Like in the Reformed tradition in the Presbyterian Church, we strongly believe that the real ordination, the real calling is baptism, that when we become Christians, we're all called into ministry together. I've shared before, I kind of have mixed feelings about the black shirt and the different titles that we give to pastors, like sort of part of our tradition also. But the truth is, at our core, we really believe that everybody is called to ministry by God, that it's not something that we set apart and give to one small group. And I think that that's a calling for this church also in this time, is that you all have amazing gifts, like and especially like as an American living in Taiwan in the age of COVID, I've often been amazed at the like technological abilities, the social abilities, like the emotional intelligence, just like the ways that Taiwanese culture has been able to do things that my own culture really couldn't do. So I think that's also true for all of us as individuals, is that there's a temptation to think that the person in the front is the expert and is going to take care of things. But really in our tradition, we believe that the day-to-day work of discipleship, the going out, the caring for people, the welcoming, that type of work is a work for all of us. It's a work that we all share in. So I hope that especially in this interim period, you feel that, like you feel a sense of responsibility and calling in your own life, and that you can think about ways that God is calling you to a deeper ministry. So in closing today, these are some thoughts for you, and I hope that our passage today is very short, so feel free to take your bulletin home and to think about it this week, to think about when am I a host and when am I a guest, and how do I show God's welcome to all people. We strongly believe that God is the one who welcomes us, and in turn we welcome others. In the sharing of the peace and in the breaking of bread, in kindness to strangers and in a willingness to receive hospitality, we show God's great welcome. You are very welcome. Let us pray. Holy God, you are the great host, the one who welcomes us to your house, the one who makes a place for us at your table, the one who invites us to be with you. God, when we welcome others, we show them your great hospitality. Let us learn our hospitality from your hospitality. Let us also open our house to prophets and to the righteous and to little ones and to all of your people. Amen.